Have you ever wondered how a trusted campus ministry could become a predator's perfect hunting ground? Well, today we're going to uncover that very question. How did Chi Alpha and the Assemblies of God become fertile ground for predators? And what it truly takes to root them out. I'm sitting down with Ron Beatty. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Oklahoma, and I wanted him to discuss his paper that he just submitted for publication. Give you a little sneak peek into his research findings he entitled A Wolf Among Lambs, The Case of Chi Alpha Sexual Abuse. Now, from the very beginning of this scandal, I've been asking a question, and one I proposed to Ryan. How in the world did this happen? How did a sexual predator with no formal ties to the Assemblies of God denomination have decades-long access within Chi Alpha to groom and abuse whoever he wanted with virtually no pushback? Today, we're going to uncover what he believes are the fundamental flaws of how Chi Alpha and the Assemblies of God became fertile ground for predators and what it truly takes to root them out. My name is Ron Bloomingkemper, and I created the forum XA in the Lion's Den to finally give voice to the Chi Alpha students and leaders who've survived spiritual and sexual abuse within that ministry. This forum really is a public record that allows them to share their stories because they've been silenced for way too long. So let's get into this. Ryan, tell us a little bit about yourself and why this topic was important enough to you to write about.
Well, hi, my name is Ron Beatty. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Oklahoma. I study organizational communication, and in particular, I am an expert in how nonprofits and member organizations, which are organizations like churches or civic groups like the Rotary Club, or fraternities or sororities or professional, associations, groups that people join for various reasons. So I'm an expert in how those types of groups operate and communicate. I have published on these issues a couple of times, moving forward with this as my career. Prior to coming to the University of Oklahoma, I was an Assemblies of God minister. I graduated from Southwestern Assemblies of God University, now Nelson University. I have a master's degree from Assemblies of God Theological Seminary, which is embedded at Evangel University. I worked for Assemblies of God corporate headquarters for 3 years. I planted a church in Houston, Texas, literally next door to Rice University, which had a very active Chi Alpha. And that church planted 2 other Assembly of God churches. We actively supported Chi Alpha. We supported Chi Alpha missionaries. We had Chi Alpha missionaries who attended our church. We had Chi Alpha students who attended our church. We had former Chi Alpha missionaries who were on staff at our church. When this broke about Daniel, we quickly discovered that, some of our staff members had, while they were on staff with us, gone to Daniel's home, that the siblings of some of our staff members had been molested by Daniel. And then we also discovered some of the things that some of the missionaries that attended our church were told concerning spiritual authority by their Chi Alpha leaders that were above them. I was really motivated to take this up because we were so deeply connected to some of the people. We considered a couple of the Chi Alpha leaders friends. Like I said, we financially supported a number of them, like the money from our church, as well as like out of our own pocket, financially supported Chi Alpha. And so I felt like, as a former Assemblies of God minister, as somebody who'd been a Assemblies of God pastor for years, as somebody who knew the Assemblies of God system, and as somebody who had a historical investment in this, combined with the fact that this is what I do now, like this is what I do. I investigate and research organizational communication, organizational behaviors, organizational practices, particularly concerning culture, and also entrepreneurialism, but particularly concerning culture, that I was uniquely qualified to do this research. So that's why I did it.
The introduction, when I first met you, I don't remember how I think you got on the forum and you started asking for interviews, and I reached out, I was like, "Whoa, dude, slow down. What's going on here?"
Yeah. So I was told about the forum. I got on the forum, saw what y'all were doing, saw what people were posting and talking about. So then I went and talked to my advisor, and I was like, "Hey, this is what's happened. This is where there's information. I should be researching this." And he was like, "Yeah, you should be researching this."
How did you hear about the forum?
I'm trying to remember how I heard about the forum. I'm pretty sure somebody sent me a link and was like, "Hey, have you heard about this?" And I jumped on, and I was just like, "Oh, all right."
So I know when we first started talking, our conversation went to the question that everybody had is, how did this happen? How did you have a guy in Chi Alpha about 25, 30 years, but I know it goes back 40 years with him being a camp counselor at a couple South Texas Assembly of God camps in the 80s. Even talked to a guy who said Daniel was his mentor in the 80s through the Assemblies of God. But my question was, okay, fast forward till 2012, he gets convicted as he's a registered sex offender now. That 10 years, everything they allowed to happen, my question goes back to, okay, how did this happen? How did we go from Jesus loves me, this I know, to now let's get naked and jerk off in front of one another? And that is such a big jump. It seems that no one has really answered that question. How far do you have to get off track for that to actually happen when there's really you got to twist the Bible, kind of like that bendable, posable Jesus you can get in those novelty shops. You got to bend that dude pretty bad in order to make that leap.
Yeah.
And what I liked was about your papers, you took that and really helped to answer that question in a system, like breaking it down as it's not just a few bad apples, or I like to call turd in the punch bowl, that they took out. It's something much deeper.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I think going back to the George Floyd death, one of the conversations that became very public in the American consciousness is in what systems are there bad apples, and then in what systems are the barrels bad, right? So people want to look at different groups or organizations, and they say, well, the organization's not bad, the group's not bad, but there are some bad apples in the group. But then other people want to say, no, the whole barrel is bad. And so for me, as I was beginning to explore this research, it was obvious that Daniel was a bad apple, right? Like that's unquestionable. Yeah. However, when you recognize that for at least a decade, Daniel had access, and this is after everyone knew he was a bad apple. He had access for a decade. That is an indicator that something else is broken, something else is rotten beyond just the apple itself. And so we're going to beat this metaphor to death, but that's when I started looking to see, okay, to what extent can we find evidence and make an argument that the barrel is bad?
No, I like your analogy and what we're going to get into. I jokingly tried to find an analogy that really, when you would tell it to somebody, they would go, "Oh, wait a second." And I use the turd in the punch bowl because if you go, "Hey, we took you're at a party, you get this big punch bowl, a couple turds floating in it, you take them out, and then you tell them, okay, it's okay now, drink." Immediately, you're like, "I'm not drinking that thing."
Yeah.
It's like you just took turds out of the punch bowl, and there could be some at the bottom of the thing. It's like, no, you're going to have to pour that out, find a new recipe, sanitize the bowl, figure out who let people put turds in the punch bowl in the first place, do all that kind of stuff before someone's going to drink. And it seems, to your point, that they focus on, there's a couple bad apples. They had influence in a few people. We've removed those people. All's well. Let's get back to business. Let's put this behind us. It's a hiccup. It's a spot on a spectrum. And that's what I'm really excited to uncover was, like you said, it's not the bad apples. It's there's something much worse. So the way we're going to do this, we'll break this down into like 4 parts. The first part to really lay the foundation on your research, the theoretical background, you call it, is 2 theories. If you could talk us through that, the optimal foraging theory and this member abusive organizations.
Yeah. So anytime we are doing any sort of academic research, we either have to understand the phenomenon that we are looking at through the lens of a theory, theories which help us, make sense of the world, or we have to recognize that this phenomenon has yet to be captured. This is one of those phenomenon that I felt like we could understand through existing theoretical frameworks. So what I did was I looked at a partnership between 2 theories, which is a pretty common approach for researchers. The first was optimal foraging theory. Optimal foraging theory was originally conceptualized as animal behaviors. So it's from the zoological world. And optimal foraging theory is used to describe how and where animals choose to forage, to gather substance or to gather sustenance, whether like a squirrel collects acorns or a fox hunts rabbits. So where does a squirrel choose to look for acorns? How does a squirrel choose to look for acorns? And then how often and in what ways does it return into the same area? And so optimal foraging theory was used for 40 years to describe how animals collected sustenance. In the early 2000s, criminologists, police officers, people who studied criminal behavior, began to use this theory to understand how criminals act. It has particularly been used to understand car thieves. So what cars do they go after? What neighborhoods do they go after cars in? How do they choose to return to the same neighborhoods to victimize again? How often do they choose? And so for 20 years, people have been studying the behaviors of criminals, particularly car thieves, using this theory to understand. This study that I conducted is the first that we are aware of that applies optimal foraging theory to sexual predators. It makes sense that sexual predators, like any other type of deviant behavior that are attempting to gather something, whether cars or jewels, in this case, bodies, would have a pattern that they use to identify victims, to gather victims, to return to the same place repeatedly. And so once I identified, hey, this looks like the same behavior, like this behavior that they're talking about among animals and among carved thieves really looks like what Daniel was doing, Daniel Savala. I then was like, okay, so now I can see how the predator was acting. But why was he able to continually act in the same place with impunity? And so then I began to look at this organizational communication theory called member abusive organizations. Member organizations are organizations that people join. So they're churches. They are civic groups like the Rotary Club. They're fraternities and sororities. They're professional organizations, right? And so they are groups that you choose to be a part of for various reasons, right? Yeah. And in 2016, two researchers named Garner and Peterson coined this phrase, member abusive organizations, in the wake of the Mars Hill Church scandal, looking at how members of that church had been abused over time and how it was the system that existed within the church that allowed for this abuse to take place and to repeat. So I began to look and to say, okay, so we've got this bad actor and we've got this bad setting. And when they find each other, you now have a toxic setting that is ideal for a toxic actor to act in. And so that's what I ended up with here in this paper, was looking at optimal foraging theory, how the predator acts, and then member abusive organizations where the predator acts and what allowed the predator to act.
Wow. So going to part 2 is really that case of Daniel Savala and Chi Alpha.
Right.
So now moving into kind of part 2, the case of Daniel Savala and Chi Alpha, and getting into a little bit of the background that, you know, like I mentioned, Daniel's involvement with the Assemblies of God goes back 40 years as a camp counselor. I even had somebody tell me that Tim Barker was his youth pastor that took him to a camp, and Daniel was his camp counselor. And I was like, dear Lord. Asked him if anything had happened. He mentioned a few stories, nothing major. But the thing that I really want to know is, how did he get involved in Chi Alpha first? And the first name we have is this guy, Eric Truel, out of Louisiana. I'd love to know how Eric met him, who introduced him, and how that relationship happened to where, I mean, they had that he was on staff. I know they deny that a lot. It may have just been a misprint or something. But the fact is he was very involved with Chi Alpha. And then moving now into the time of events, do you want to walk through kind of what you have in your research, some key incidents?
Yeah. So based on the information I was able to gather, Daniel Savala was first introduced to Sam Houston State Chi Alpha leaders, it looks like 1996. And then in the mid 2000s, so the mid first decade, is when Chi Alpha leaders, probably small group leaders, maybe higher level leaders, were taking students to Daniel Savala's home in Houston, leading up to his arrest in 2012. So we know that it's a matter of public record that Daniel Savala was arrested in Alaska for 11 counts of child molestation in 2012. He pled guilty to one of those and was put in prison as a result of that. We also know that in 2012...
90 days.
90 days.
I keep telling people, 90 days for doing that is the greatest form of injustice.
Yeah, 90 days for the molestation of 11 children. We also...
Not 11 children. I think it was like 11 counts.
Oh, 11 counts. It may be multiple. Yeah. Just...
You want to know something really, really crazy? So when I first learned this, somebody told me, I need in 2012 or 2013, I think it was, you need to Google Daniel Savala and Sitka, Alaska. And I was like, okay, I haven't had any contact with Daniel for years. And I Googled it and I saw that news article. And I started to research. The first thing I did was call the reporter, and I said, hey, what's the background on this? And I remember him saying that there were so many people that came up to talk to him that didn't want to be on the record, but he said it was overwhelming. And now that we've learned it could be up to, I've heard anywhere from 10 to 15 victims while he was in Alaska, and some even maybe who've come from other mission trips. We'll never know really how many there were.
Yeah, and when it comes to, the research that I engage in, it's important that for me and for the credibility of what it is exactly that I'm trying to do is that I as a person can say, what, I think you're probably right. There's probably more. However, all we can do right now is to say this is what the research, this is what the data we have on hand, we for sure know, right? But what's interesting and important for the research here when we talk about the bad apple and the bad barrel is that we also know that we have this letter from Eli Gotro in 2012 raising $10,000 roughly for Daniel's legal fees, and then sending a young man up there to chaperone Daniel. And then in 2013, after his 90 days of prison or county jail, wherever he spent that time, it was Sam Houston State that helped him, and Chi Alpha. It was money that Chi Alpha leaders raised that helped him move back to Texas, right? So there's this intricate involvement between the Chi Alpha leaders and the protection of Daniel, the provision of Daniel, and then moving Daniel back to Texas, where he can then be promoted still within Chi Alpha. We also know that you called Tim Barker in 2013. As early as 2013, the South Texas District was aware that a convicted sex offender was working with their Chi Alpha. We know that in 2016, a Title IX case was filed at Sam Houston State. We know in 2017, a staff member at Texas A&M Corpus Christi was fired for raising concerns about Daniel. We know in 2018, Scott Martin, the National Chi Alpha Director, Donna Barrett, the General Secretary of the Assemblies of God, Doug Clay, the General Superintendent of the Assemblies of God, Galen Claunch, the North Texas District Superintendent, Tim Barker, the South Texas District Superintendent, as well as their Secretary Treasurers, were aware of Daniel's ongoing participation when it comes to a number of Chi Alphas. We also know that Scott Martin knew about the Title IX case. That's in the emails, right? We have emails that shows. I also let me say this. I think it is important for your listeners or anybody who may listen to this to need to know what a Title IX investigation is, because those are rarely spoken of outside of academic settings. Title IX is a code of protection put in place by the federal government, applied to any entity that is partially to fully funded by the federal government. It is designed to protect the members of the organization in which the federal government funds. So a Title IX investigation would mean that somebody made a credible claim of either abuse, assault, of harassment, of a sexual or gendered nature against an individual. The other thing about that is, however, it can only be filed on a university campus if it took place as part of a university activity. So the fact that it was filed, it was allowed to be filed, is evidence that whatever others are saying concerning Daniel Savala's access to students in 2016, because there's some documents, claims, tweets, whatever, that say that according to Eli Gotro, Daniel Savala had not had any interaction with any Chi Alpha students after 2014, I think. Well, the reality... 2012. Well, the reality is...
As soon as we knew that we distanced ourselves, and that's been the narrative that you're like, well, if you distance yourselves, how come you got so many people who are being molested? You're doing mission trips to his house. You know, even as of a few years ago, Daniel's sitting in your pews in your church.
Yeah. Well, the reality is Sam Houston State University doesn't let someone file a 2016 complaint off of if the person that committed the act isn't seen as being a part of the organization that it's connected to, right? Like that's a good point. If Sam Houston State, if somebody comes to them and says, hey, I want to file a Title IX against Daniel Savala because he assaulted me, molested me, Sam Houston State has to be able to confirm that Daniel Savala had some sort of capacity with an organization that has a capacity with Sam Houston State. Otherwise, they're going to say, look, we're really sorry that happened. However, that occurred in a non-university capacity, so you need to go to the local police department about that.
You know, that's a really good point, because I didn't even think about it, because A&M did a Title IX, and they're actually removed from College Station as of we're recording this. The Assembly of God always says, well, he's not one of us. He doesn't have papers. You know, he's not a part of the organization. Well, if that's true, then the Title IX really couldn't have happened if he was not connected to that organization, or like you said, it happened off campus or something.
There was a strong enough affiliation in 2016 for Sam Houston State University to allow a Title IX charge to be filed and an investigation to take place.
Yeah.
If Daniel was in no way affiliated, Sam Houston State would not have allowed an investigation to move forward.
Absolutely. And in that case, there was a sexual abuse case, why it happened. And they did everything. And this is my question I've had, probably about a year and a half. Well, actually being in it and trying to warn people for a very long time. This question popped into my head because people were trying to gaslight, all that other kind of stuff. My question to people who were friends, we have no ill will against them. All we wanted to do is warn them. And the question I always had was, what more could we have done to warn you? Like you're going down the timeline right now. You have been warned, which I believe God has sent so many people to your campus. We have records now, people warning you and you firing them, or people warning you and then you gaslight them. Oh, well, they're not a Christian, or they're bitter. The bitter, angry thing is such a lazy argument for Christians.
Yeah, I think that the important thing is that Title IX investigation from 2016, Scott Martin was aware of it in 2018. It's in the emails, right? So those emails
they knew.
Were copied.
It's kind of like they knew. What do they know? When did they know it?
Yeah, they knew. They were aware. They were aware that he had continued presence and continued access.
I'm pretty sure the only one that didn't know is probably the Assembly of God janitor that was working his way through there. It wasn't on the email. I mean, everybody's copied on that email.
Yeah, they're all of the full-time presbyters in North Texas and South Texas, and then half of the executive leadership team from the Assemblies of God were aware. They're all aware. And then we see, things really speed up starting in July 2022, whether that's the arrest of the Texas A&M Corpus Christi Chi Alpha director, the investigation into Eli Stewart by North Texas, the breaking of the story by the Battalion, the Texas A&M newspaper, the launch of the Lion's Den, ultimately leading to the arrest of Savala and Hundle and others, right? So this has been happening, and these dates aren't conjecture. These dates come from timestamps on emails. They come from timestamps on official documents. They come from news outlets, and I don't just mean like Christian versions of the National Enquirer. I mean ABC, NBC, CBS, right?
I tell people all the time, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Some of these lawsuits are going to take years. The average age that used to say for somebody who is a male who's been sexually abused takes, as a child or maybe a teen or college, takes until they're in their 50s on to their 70s before they'll come forward. And we said, the thing is you cannot, in my opinion, and from what I've heard talking to a lot of different other trauma abuse counselors, it's really hard to get fully healed unless justice happens or there's some kind of accountability. Because the church, like I remember the quote that always sticks with me was this one girl who was abused in the church setting said, it wasn't so much the abuse that was the terrible thing if you compare it to the way the church handled it. Mm-hmm. That was much worse, how they gaslit you, excommunicated you, all that kind of stuff. People you thought were your friends are no longer your friends anymore because they think it makes the church look bad. And it goes back to that, the opposite of what Jesus said. We're going to leave the 99, rally against the one to protect them. In this corporate American church setting, it seems that we're going to just say, forget the one, and we're going to rally around the 99 because we got bills to pay.
Right. We have a reputation to protect.
Okay, let's get into now the meat of it. Part 3 is the cultural and structural dynamics enabling the abuse. So you can start off with your the one question that we really asked, or that I asked in the very beginning. I love that you took it. You can read your question and kind of take it from there.
Yeah. So in any sort of research, you're going to start with either a hypothesis or a research question. And so my research question, and I only developed one for this study, but it was what cultural and structural elements at the local and national levels contributed to a sexual predator's prolonged participation with a religious organization. So what was going on at Chi Alpha locally and in the Assemblies of God that allowed this to happen? What were the structural elements? What was going on in the system that enabled this to take place? Now, I wanted to answer this question well. I didn't want to guess. One of the things that frustrates me as a researcher and just as a thinking person is reductionist arguments. So when people try to take an extremely complex issue with a number of variables and contributing factors and boil it all down to like one thing, well, that doesn't solve and it doesn't help, right? It's just this one thing, right? Ultimately, this happened because this one thing. No, it's never the one thing. And quite often it's both, it's multiple things. And even at times, it can be things that are antagonistic towards each other, right? It can be two things at the same time that often operate in antagonism against each other, but in this setting contributed to this horrific situation. So in order to understand it, I conducted what's called a case study, and I followed an approach taken by these two researchers named Lucas and Fike. They published an article in 2014 looking at the Penn State Joe Paterno sex scandal, where the defensive coordinator working under Joe Paterno at Penn State molested children for years. And it was talked about in euphemism and ignored. And so I took the same approach they did to look at this scandal. And so what I did was I consulted with 62 different sources of data. I looked at 39 different witness and victim statements. I examined information at 9 different media outlets. I looked at 13 different internal Assemblies of God documents. And then I conducted semi-structured, in-depth interviews with 3 witnesses. And so from that data, from those pages and pages of data, I ended up with the information that I found. Now, in order to ensure that everything was trustworthy, I engaged in a couple of what's called validation strategies. It's how we validate the data and how we validate our findings. So number one is I engaged in member checks, which means as I was trying to make sense of the data, I would talk to people who were there. I would talk to witnesses, I would talk to victims, and I would say, is this correct? Give me feedback on this, right? Like, so for instance, I contacted you to say, hey, do I have the date right in which Daniel was introduced to the Sam Houston State guys? And you were actually like, no, he was introduced on this date. And I was like, okay, great. So that's a member check.
Yeah.
I conducted peer review, which means I got other researchers to look at what I was doing to make sure that I was being fair, and that I was being led by the data, not being led by my own passions. I also use what's called a thick description. And so it's one thing to argue with how I may summarize data. It's another thing to argue with direct quotes from the data. So I consulted 62 unique pieces of data. I directly quote in my study 41 different sources. So I'm not depending on the same 2 or 3 people. We're talking about 41 unique individuals or sources of data were directly quoted. And then finally, I let people know up front who I am and why this matters to me. That as a former Assemblies of God minister who pastored next to Rice University, who financially supported multiple Chi Alphas, who had Chi Alpha people in my church, who had people in my church whose siblings were victims of Daniel Savala, this is important to me. And now people may say, well, doesn't that mean you're biased? Yes, it does. It does mean I'm biased. But I admit to you that I'm biased, and I give you all the other things to show you how I combated my bias. And so that's how we end up where we're at.
And that premise on your slide about the bad apple, go through that real quick. That's how you got to your the premise, the problem.
Yeah.
Is what happens when a bad apple finds a bad barrel.
Yeah. You could think about it another way because of we call this wolf among the lambs. What happens when a wolf finds a sheep pen that's left unprotected and broken down?
Yeah.
And that's a very apt description of what happened here. A wolf.
In this case, you got the guys driving the sheep to the wolf's house.
Yeah.
Which is funny because, his room, I think it was his website, was called the Lion's Den. His room was called the Cave, but, people call his room the Lion's Den as well. You're literally driving the lion to the sheep.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So here's what I found. Looking at all of this data, analyzing it according to proven methods for data analyzation, I found that at Chi Alpha, there were 5 pieces of the culture that contributed together to allow for Daniel to be there. And not just allow for him to be there, but allow for him to operate in and among them without anybody ever stopping him.
One point I'd like to make before you get into this is the fact that he groomed everybody, I like to say. It was who he brought in. He even groomed people to be able to say, oh, he's never seen anything like that. He's just, he's a man of God. I put my kids around him, all that kind of stuff. But the real tragedy of this whole thing is he's groomed people, and his victims in some cases became predators. And those guys became predators. And that's what we're finding out, especially out of Sam Houston. I always call it like, Revenge of the Body Snatchers, to where we have no idea how far this ideology, this culture, indoctrination goes from Daniel on how many campuses. But it's just, like I said, I get calls all across the country. Oh yeah, Sam Houston was influenced us, from all over the world.
Yeah. Well, I used to teach a child sexual abuse prevention training at a school that I worked for. And one of the things that we would say in the training is that abusers abuse, but abusers have been abused. And so there is this cycle that is perpetuated within abuse, particularly among minors, that it's particularly pronounced that if you have been abused as a minor, your chances of being an abuser are exponentially higher.
Yeah.
And so, of course, there's a domino effect, right?
Yeah. Well, I like your findings. Like I said, we'll go through there. There's 5 of them you found within the Chi Alpha organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the first one is Chi Alpha had a culture of elitism. And when I say elitism, what I mean is that elitism refers to the cultural assumption that membership within a group indicates a higher status of worth above non-members. So there was this belief within Chi Alpha that Chi Alpha members had a higher status than non-members on that campus. And that extended not only to non-believers. We have plenty of data that proves or provides evidence that it extended to other Christian organizations on campus, which in and of itself runs contradictory to Chi Alpha's stated and expressed values. Chi Alpha says that they agreed to the Chicago Statement on collegiality between campus ministries. And yet everything that they then said and did ran contrary to that, right? They would make statements like there are really no other Christian organizations on campus, or they would belittle the Bible study efforts of other organizations and dismiss the teachings from other ministries. So there's this elitism that existed, and other people referred to, right? You see on the screen, people quoted Chi Alpha as being cliquish and called them said they were being judgmental elitists. So the people within Chi Alpha considered people within Chi Alpha to be of higher status than anybody else on campus. And if you were part of Chi Alpha, then you're just better. And there's really, unfortunately, no other way to put it.
There's a story they tell about a prophecy that was made at Sam Houston, I think in the 70s or something like that, that, God's going to pour out his spirit on the campus, and they're going to shut down school and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, man, that's amazing. But what I find funny is it doesn't mean it has to come through you. God can do it through anybody.
Absolutely.
And, one of the things I heard was when all this broke, their argument was, man, we've been praying for so long, and we're on the verge of a revival or a shaking, and then the devil is bringing this. The Antichrist spirit is coming against us to do this, and I'm like, guys, when you pray for shaking and God starts shaking, you can't then turn around and rebuke the devil,
right?
Because that's part of his process. I call it the dirty side of revival, where it's not the fun, jumping up, happy stuff. It's no, I'm coming to clean house.
The devil never works on the side of justice.
And he doesn't expose evil.
No, absolutely right. Jesus said that the enemy comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy, that he is the father of lies. It is against the enemy's nature to expose lies as lies and to expose himself as a liar. And so the idea that the enemy would be uncovering truth is counterintuitive and counter his own nature.
I say it like this, that the leadership for decades had a devil in their midst with Daniel, and called him the holiest man alive. They never spotted how wicked this guy really was. And then God comes in their midst in the last few years to say, guys, I love you enough. I'm going to clean this up. And they start calling it the devil. And I thought, as a leader, if you have no discernment, if you don't have the gifts or the calling to spot that, if you think when the devil's moving, it's God, and when God's moving, it's the devil, I like to say, man, you need to get a job. This gig ain't for you.
Yeah. There's the scriptures even tell us that the enemy will masquerade as an angel of light. Right.
Yeah.
And so that if that's not an apt metaphor for what Daniel did and who Daniel was, I don't know what is. Right. You're saying this is the holiest man alive while he's raping and molesting young men and boys.
Yeah. So the second finding
So the second finding that I had goes to what we're talking about right now, which was that in addition to elitism, there was also a culture of coercion and control. In this setting, coercion and control looked like spiritual abuse. And spiritual abuse actually has a real definition in the research world, and it is the misuse of power in a spiritual context. And so we know that this was taking place because the culture was described by multiple people as that of one of shame and guilt and fear. One person has come out and said that they have been diagnosed with PTSD, that they have to use a service dog, that they can't even drive in the same town where their chapter was located anymore without having complete mental breakdown. And then we see direct quotes about how they would abuse, right? They would say things like, friends have the right to command each other, as if the leaders were actually their friends. Because there's no way that goes two ways, right? That's downward, right? Nobody commanded Eli Stewart. Nobody commanded Eli Gotro. And
no, the funny thing that you said, there was a story that I'll never forget. I talked to this Chi Alpha leader who, I told him, stand up, speak out, help us find victims. And he's like, there's no way I'm coming against Eli Stewart. I was like, why? He was so afraid of this guy. And his quote was that he will ruin my career if I stand up. And he said this, he said, no man can ever remove Eli Stewart. And just came into my mind. It was like, well, that's okay, because it's not a man that's leading this movement. And I think Eli, a week or so later, was put on suspension.
Wow. So we have elitism, we have coercion and control, which in this context looks like spiritual abuse. We also have hero worship, right? I think everybody's well aware of the hero worship that was engaged in at Chi Alpha. And hero worship is the extreme practice of evaluating and admiring specific others as an exemplar for imitation, right? And so there was this extreme follow me as I follow Christ, distorted approach that manifests itself in quotes like, you should obey the leader even if he's wrong and leave matters in God's hand to judge. The idea that you had to follow the leader's direction in your life, even if they told you to sin, is
I'm telling you, man,
insane.
I just heard something actually today and a few weeks ago that just confirms all this stuff, where and the thing I think they get wrong, there's a bunch of stuff, but one of them is they've turned leadership into lordship. They've really exalted these guys who, to be honest, as small group leaders, he's my spiritual authority. Well, you're 18 years old, you barely are saved or just got saved, they'll tell me. You're doing all this stuff. Like one guy told me, he said, they made me a small group leader and I've never read the Bible. I was like, are you serious? Others were like, we were doing drugs. We were involved in sexual immorality and all this stuff. And it was just to keep the perception of, look at us, how we're growing. Look at how many small group leaders there were, like you and I were talking about this afternoon. The fact that Sam Houston ordained more campus pastors or ordained more people than Sagu did.
Yeah, during the heyday of the mid-20 teens, more ministers were credentialed in the South Texas district out of Chi Alpha than out of the Assemblies of God University in Texas.
I mean, when you're producing that kind of money and power, and all of a sudden now the voting right, with these Chi Alpha students. I mean, I've had pastors tell me we can't even do anything in our district because we get outvoted, however many to just a few pastors.
Yeah. And so when you have this sort of culture that engages with like this elitism, we're better than everybody else, and this coercion and control, I've got to submit, to their authority. Well, then of course you're going to end up with hero worship, right? Like they're the elite leaders in control. So of course you gotta believe that they're the best, right? And we even had people who said, we were told that if you don't agree with the top leaders, then point blank, you're wrong, and you will be corrected to know the vision.
That quote you have in there, I did not want to know anything negative about my leader. I had to submit to them. I remember that story was one of the first ones when I went to a dad and I said, hey, listen, Daniel is still involved. This is what he did. And long story short, he finally ended up telling one of his kids who was a leader in Chi Alpha, I won't mention which university, but he finally told them, and I remember what he said. He said that my kid basically said, I don't want to know anything negative or bad about my leader. I have to submit to him. And I was like, jerk your kid out of there like yesterday.
Yeah.
That is a cult.
Yeah.
Cult thinking thinks like that. That's not even, I can't hear anything negative about somebody, or I can't ask them questions because I have to submit to them.
Yeah, I am aware of an individual who Eli Gotro told their parents that Eli was their spiritual authority now, and that he would be telling them how to live their lives and what they would do with their lives, and that their parents had no more influence over their life, or at least their influence was subject to his influence.
Yeah, well, I've got A&M, Eli Stewart. Somebody sent me the screenshot of a leadership meeting where he basically said, hey, guys, we're all one family. We can all, what did he say, parent each other's kids. Like, wait, what? And I've actually heard him talk about, I was at Sam Houston, I think in 2012, that Christmas, I believe it was then, when he was saying, hey, you're going to go home. Your parents aren't going to understand what you're doing up here. And me and my friend Lewis, we looked at each other like, dude, that's not good. I mean, there were so many red flags when we went up there, and now it's all coming to fruition.
Yeah. Well, and it shouldn't surprise us then that when you've got elitism and coercion and control and hero worship, that if anything negative is said, they circle the wagons and engage in victim blaming. And victim blaming was the fourth element that I found. And so victim blaming is the attribution of negative events to the internal character or actions of a person on whom the events fall, rather than the external circumstances and causes of the events. So it's saying that basically you deserved this bad thing to happen to you. This bad thing happened to you because there's something wrong with you, not because whoever perpetrated this bad thing was wrong. While that's difficult to believe, of course, this would occur when you've got elitism and coercion and control and hero worship. And the results are that we have people who said that they were told when they talked about their molestation at the hands of Daniel that they were full of shit. That's a direct quote. That was and it was, that direct quote is attributed to the deputy director of Chi Alpha at Sam Houston State at the time. Yeah. And so that person you saying you were molested by Daniel, you're full of shit, you're working with the devil, you are the enemy. Same person said that if anyone's hurt in ministry, it's your fault. It's your fault that you got hurt. And if you leave Chi Alpha, you're leaving the faith. And then anybody who was molested is to blame for the molestation because they weren't spiritually strong enough to keep it away, right? They were completely unable to accept that there was any weak spot in their armor. And so they had to assign an attribution. They had to blame somebody else. And the only person left to blame was the person that it happened to. So that's what they did. Yeah. And like I was saying, the same guy I was talking to confronted Eli Gotro and said, well, what about this guy? He told you and or warned you or something. And I remember him saying, well, dude, Ron's not even a Christian. He's bitter. He's angry. That's what he told me. And that's been the narrative for a very long time. Like, guys, I've not been angry for a decade. It's like I wanted nothing to do with this. I was healed. I was moving on. It was, that meeting that we were invited to, and my pastor came back and said, you're not going to believe this. We were invited to a meeting at this guy's house with all these kids in Chi Alpha. And he's like, they're promoting Daniel Savala. And I'm like, the registered sex offender? He's like, you need to tell the guy who invited us. And then that led kind of onto this journey. But victim blaming, you're right, is such a, I call it a lazy argument when you just go after the people. Every time someone posts something and shares their story on the website, I will get
I don't know how many emails from the church or different people. Well, that's not true. This person is like this and this. I was like, okay, maybe one or two, but our forum has over 3 million page views, and there are hundreds and hundreds of testimonies and stories and comments. I don't know how you went through it all, to be honest with you. I don't think I've read all of it.
Yeah, well, I actually addressed this in the paper in my methods section, and I talk about how that, we would be foolish to not consider that there are some people who have various motivations as to why they would make certain comments or statements. However, when we have dozens upon dozens upon dozens of testimonies from different times and different locations, all of which are saying the same thing.
It's the common denominator.
There is a common thread that repeats itself over and over again. It's, you have to say, okay, are these 50 people lying, or are these 6 that have that are the subject?
Everything to lose,
right? Yeah, that are the uniting thread here, right? And that have everything to lose, like you said. And so there's you can only come to the conclusion that something's not right in Mudville, right? Mighty Casey struck out.
I tell people all the time, for everything you read on there, I've got probably 3 to 4 stories that we're either not allowed to post, or they said don't share my name or don't share my story. I mean, I have hundreds. My phone is like got all these numbers. I have no names in them. I'm like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. Texting this person going, who are you again?
Yeah.
And, but and that's the thing. I look for common denominators, and now I'm getting calls from all over the nation. I mean, literally, and the sexual abuse isn't the big thing. It's the spiritual abuse. And which goes back decades.
Well, the sexual abuse is able to occur because the spiritual abuse occurs. And that's the next point here, is that the 5th element is this normalization of sexualization. But what's important to know here is that normalization of sexualization was introduced by Daniel only after these previous 4 elements had been ingrained in and were the norm of the culture at Chi Alpha. He was able to introduce the normalization of sexualization. Physical sexual abuse was able to occur because spiritual abuse had been occurring. He was able to access them because in this culture of elitism, he was considered the elite among the elite. He was the hero to the heroes.
And that's something that I've heard time and time again, including my own testimony of, we were told he was the holiest man alive. And when, he groomed me, and when he asked me to do something, I saw a lot of red flags. I actually had a dream one night that was really crazy, but it's almost like you don't listen to your gut or your discernment, because you're told by people you trust in leadership, no, this guy is holy. And I've heard that so many now from some of these Chi Alpha guys who were victims and survivors, was I'm sitting there feeling like I'm in a different, reality, going, is this happening? This is supposed to be the holiest man alive. And then they don't tell, or when they do tell, they're just pushed off like you had in your thing. So many of these leaders never warned their students or their leaders below them about this.
Yeah, they were completely afraid of what would happen. And so Daniel was able to introduce this idea of nudity as unity. He was able to introduce masturbation as a common conversation, pornography as a common conversation, because these other elements existed. And then when
Yeah.
he did introduce this normalization of sexualization, these elitism, victim blaming, coercion and control elements then infiltrated and infiltrated isn't the right word, but then morphed alongside this normalization of sexualization to where it then went beyond Daniel, right? We have story after story of sock talks or of girls flashing each other or girls, physically hitting,
skinny dipping,
hitting other women in their breasts, being told that if they didn't like that, they were no fun, that they couldn't take a joke, that they were too sensitive, even to the point
there was
that
a sermon.
One young woman said that when she told them no, she was not going to skinny dip with them, the response was she was willingly creating disunity. That's the exact phrase that was used. That
I know.
Because you were unwilling to violate your own morals and be naked in an absolute overt sexual way with other women, that you were willingly creating disunity.
Yeah, and the crazy part is when I first heard nudity is unity, I did a double take. I said, wait, what did you say? He's like, nudity is unity. And I started hearing on other campuses, and I'm like, you're kidding me, right? There was a news person in College Station that I talked to, and I kind of joked with her. I said, was it on your bingo card that you ever in your career would give a news presentation and start it off as nudity is unity? She's like, no, I had no. She was like, even saying that was like, this is weird. But that was the culture that a lot of these guys, like somebody sent me this where they would say, true friends and brothers, we know each other's penis size. True friends and brothers, we talk about our sex lives. We have one guy said his pastor during a Bible study, he's like, man, I got my knob polished.
Yeah.
I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, I just got a blowjob from my wife. I'm like, this is a freaking elder in the church.
Yeah, that is, that is how demeaning of his wife. Right? Like first and foremost, to feel as though you can speak in such a dishonorable way about your spouse and such a demeaning way about your spouse is completely deplorable.
Okay, going back to your analogy of it's not just bad apples, but it's a bad barrel. Mm-hmm. The barrel in this illustration is the Assemblies of God.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we've got the bad apple, Daniel, and we've got the bad barrel, which is the local Chi Alpha. But then we've also got Chi Alpha is a part of a bigger barrel, right? Chi Alpha doesn't stand in isolation. It stands as a part of the Assemblies of God.
So real quick, for those who don't know the Assembly of God structure, go through the hierarchy, and tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the best way to explain this is that the Assemblies of God functions as a national network of churches in networks. So the local...
They hate saying they're a denomination, right?
They
don't say they're a denomination. They say we're a fellowship.
A voluntary cooperative fellowship is the language of the Assemblies of God, that they are a part of a voluntary cooperative fellowship. And the reason there's actually a legal distinction, and which plays to the very heart of this paper. If you are a denomination, you have responsibilities that a voluntary cooperative fellowship does not legally have. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have moral responsibilities, ethical responsibilities, and most importantly, that you don't have kingdom of God responsibilities. But denominations have legal responsibilities that a voluntary cooperative fellowship does not have. So in the Assemblies of God, there are regional networks of churches that they call districts. The Assemblies of God operates according to a free church structure, which means that every local church is autonomous. They elect their own pastors, their own boards, they run themselves, and then of the church's own volition are a part of the Assemblies of God. They join the local regional network, which is generally called and historically been called a district. And there's something like 62 something-ish districts in the United States. Some states like Texas are extremely large, both geographically as well as population-wise. So there's multiple districts in a state. Some districts overlap multiple states because the region is smaller and are less populated, whatever. So the Assemblies of God consist of these districts, and every one of these districts have corporate offices. But the Assemblies of God as a whole also has a corporate office. And the Assemblies of God then is broken into, is divided like many corporations are, into divisions. And one of the divisions is the division of home missions. The division of U.S. missions is what it's called. So there's the division of U.S. missions, which is run by the director of U.S. missions, which is a member of the Assemblies of God executive leadership team, one of the top 6 corporate executives in the Assemblies of God, somebody that is elected by the Assemblies of God ministers at their general council on a 4-year cycle. So within the division of U.S. missions, there is the Department of Chi Alpha Campus Ministries. Chi Alpha Campus Ministries has a national director, a training coordinator, and a number of other office corporate personnel. The Department of Chi Alpha works in conjunction with the Division of U.S. Missions to send out U.S. missionaries. U.S. missionaries are individuals who are credentialed with the Assemblies of God through local districts, because that's how the Assemblies of God works their credentialing process, their ordination process is through the local districts. But it is nationally that someone is given an appointment as a U.S. missionary. And an account is opened at the national office. They raise funds to financially support themselves, and all of that money funnels through the general council and then is distributed monthly in the form of a paycheck to the U.S. missionary, as well as to a work account. They withhold taxes, they withhold for medical insurance, and they also withhold a service fee percentage to fund the national office to manage these things for them.
The fellowship.
The fellowship, yes. Now, if you were to look at all of that on a flow chart, it would be pretty clear.
Yeah.
The problem then, however, starts that when you are appointed as a U.S. missionary within Chi Alpha and sent to a university that exists geographically within a local district, who are you responsible to?
I heard a guy tell me, some campus pastor who is actually leaving. He goes, Ron, I got like 9 different bosses. I was like, what is it, like Office Space?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, he goes, yeah, and he listed them all. I'm like, well, how do you know who you're supposed to? It's just the most confusing crap I've ever heard.
Yeah, and so U.S. missionaries and U.S. missions outposts, like local Chi Alpha chapters, there is a U.S. missions manual. And up until earlier this year, when it was completely revamped after a new U.S. missions director came in, the line concerning oversight and accountability for Chi Alpha was literally a line. There was one sentence that said, U.S. missions will work in cooperation with the local district to provide oversight and accountability for Chi Alpha. That was it. That's all it said.
Yeah.
It did not outline how that occurred. It did not outline under what circumstances U.S. Mission stepped in, under what circumstances the district stepped in. It was vague and intentionally so, which goes to now these findings that I see that allowed for this to happen in the Assemblies of God, right? Like that allowed for Daniel to exist in an Assemblies of God ministry for this long period of time when they knew he was there. And so
it's kind of like you want the authority of a king, but the responsibility and accountability of a child.
Yeah, that is a real good way to think about it.
So moving on, what structural elements did you find that existed within the Assemblies of God that really allowed this grooming, this abuse to happen?
Yeah, so I found 3 different institutional contexts that supported Daniel's access. The first is a phenomenon that's called differentiation. Differentiation is an organizational rhetorical strategy which declares an issue to be unrelated to another or separating the organization from responsibility. So what we saw here was the institutional leaders engaged in this separating of the organization from responsibility concerning Daniel. Right? They said things like, well, doesn't hold ministerial credentials. He's not associated in an official capacity, right? So it's this separating from Daniel action, this differentiation, as in he is different from us. Then they also separated the Sam Houston State lineage tree from the rest of Chi Alpha by saying when Doug Clay, the general superintendent, said, well, this was a hiccup, a shortcoming, a failure by a small portion, and don't paint the whole by this broad brush, right? Again, this is a differentiation strategy. This is a rhetorical way in which they say don't blame the whole based on the little. It's a separation.
You know what I thought about the other day? I was thinking about that, and I said, well, he assumes that the whole is healthy.
Of course.
What if the whole isn't healthy? Like, what if like you said, the system needs to come down? The system that is created is unhealthy, and even in some cases unbiblical. He just assumes that this is like I said, a few. Like Scott Martin said, oh, Daniel had influence in a few people. Well, those few people were your golden boys. They were the gold standard Chi Alphas that were taught. They were revered. They won awards. The real thing that scares me is nobody knows how deep this goes with coming out of Sam Houston, that ideology and those ideas and those attitudes. And the second thing that frustrates all of us working with this is it seems that no one cares to find out. They're already, we're moving on, forget the past. No, you can't move on unless justice happens.
Yeah.
And accountability happens.
Well, there's this concern that if they continue to pull the string, it will all continue to unravel. And the fear is that what is still left to lose is worse than what has already been lost. So let's just stop now. We think, we're going to say we've cut out the disease, but the problem is you've examined the disease in the finger. You haven't looked up the rest of the arm or the rest of the body to see how deeply the disease has spread.
Yeah.
So the AG institutionally engaged in this differentiation, this he's not one of us, separating him from us. the Assemblies of God also engaged in what's called strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity refers to the deliberate use of vague and unclear communication that benefits collective goal attainment. It's usually within the context of organizational policies and systems. So because the AG owns or defines itself as a voluntary cooperative fellowship, not a denomination, they then engage in this intentional vagueness throughout many of their policies because they can. Because if it's intentionally vague, then they are intentionally not responsible. And so that's why when we look at the email that Donna Barrett sends in 2018, she makes a statement like, Chi Alpha is not this Chi Alpha is not under the purview of the General Council to become involved in local church issues. Local districts handle this situation. The problem is, says what? What says the local districts handle the situation? Nothing. The U.S. Missions Manual doesn't say that. The Assemblies of God bylaws doesn't say that. The South Texas District bylaws don't say that. Not when it comes to a Chi Alpha. A Chi Alpha is a U.S. missions outpost. It's not a local church. And so what says that it's not under the purview of the General Council to become in local church issues? And whose purview is it? That's the thing. It never says anywhere. The U.S. Missions Manual, the Assemblies of God bylaws, the District Council bylaws are intentionally vague. They are strategically vague so that nobody has to be. The system has been set up to protect the whole by creating intentional vagueness that legally protects them.
Wow.
And allows them to then say, that's not our responsibility. So whereas differentiation with the individual, right? He's not one of us, so we're not responsible. Yeah. In this situation, okay, Chi Alpha is of us, but our bylaws and our guiding documents are so intentionally vague, nobody can be held responsible or accountable to them. That's strategic ambiguity.
You know, that's what I've noticed the now 2 years uncovering a lot of this stuff, especially when they say, oh, they've gone up for a discipline. Nobody has a standard disciplinary outline of what that happens. And I heard sometimes just a joke. It's like, here's a workbook and call me, and then other people do it correctly. And then there's no, as a brand strategist, there seems to be no brand or organizational standards.
It is
in one aspect.
Again, it's intentionally vague so that it works for the people in power. The disciplinary system in the Assemblies of God, much like this, is not meant to work for the people in discipline. It's meant to work for the institution. It's intentionally written in such ways that the district superintendent, the district secretary treasurer, whoever it is handling discipline, whether over an individual or a outpost of ministry like Chi Alpha, can interpret the bylaws to mean whatever they need them to mean at that point in time.
Yeah.
So then because of that, because of this differentiation and this strategic ambiguity, the final thing that I observed, or the final institutional context that I observed, is actually a phenomenon that I am proposing. This is not a phenomenon that has been previously proposed or defended within business organizational ethics literature. So I'm proposing the idea of organizational moral negligence. Now, there is a there is a concept called organizational moral ignorance. It has been established to be understood as an organization's unawareness and their lack of reaction to the moral intuition of its employees or members. In the Assemblies of God, however, we know there was no unawareness. The institutional leaders were aware. And when you are careless, or when carelessness reaches to culpability of the breach of duty, that's how the Oxford Legal Dictionary defines negligence. So what I propose, what I offer is that the Assemblies of God's response goes beyond moral ignorance into the realm of moral negligence, that they engage in intentional, careless reactions by the organization to the moral needs of its members.
I mean, when you put an NDA on somebody to shut them up, I mean, it doesn't get any worse than that.
I agree. And when you have a whistleblower call you and say, hey, you've got a convicted sex offender working with your groups, you need to get on this. And 3 weeks later, you call back and they say, oh, yeah, I forgot you called.
Oh, yeah.
And
that's crazy.
There's no more ideal example of negligence than that. We know.
I call it gross negligence.
We know that they knew. We know that they knew. It is undeniable that they knew, and that their reaction to their knowledge was careless.
Yeah, I've never seen a more untransparent organization in my life, when the church should be the most transparent thing. Like, they could have done this in a way that would have glorified God and made people stand up and go, wow. Like when I went to a church and said, man, you could be the church that, you know, champions this and all this stuff. I went and then come to find out their college group was sending people to Daniel's. Then it switched to, well, man, crap, you could have victims here. And then really quick, it became into this, okay, we're shutting up, we're not saying anything, you know, and then stories get talked about them on the forum, and then we get lawsuits, you know, and all this stuff. And you're just like, wait a second, we're trying to help you guys. It was the weirdest experience of my life to try and help friends expose this. And then you're just like, now you're enemy. I've lost, I wouldn't say a bunch of friends, but a number of friends I've known for decades because you just want to help people.
Mm.
So what would your recommendations be that go beyond, you know, what we're seeing right now? We just don't see that they're doing anything. There's no transparency. They're keeping things very close to the chest. I was told very early on at a men's group when we had a guy from the Assemblies basically tell me that it's not my, I shouldn't be exposing this. I'm not in the AG. We don't air our dirty laundry out. And I'm like, dude, you're part of the church. I don't care what denomination you are.
Yeah. Well, they are at the point now to where if they're not airing their dirty laundry, then their dirty laundry is still dirty and it's mildewing. Yeah. So based on the research that I've conducted here, I have 3 recommendations for any organization that wishes to ensure that this type of offense never occurs in their in their context, whether a church, a parachurch ministry, a nonprofit, even a corporation, right? These are transferable recommendations to any organizational setting. The first thing you have to do is put out the boots. And when we say put out the boots, that's a metaphor for signaling to predators that this organization is not safe for them to forage. Yeah. Putting out the boots actually is a practice that recently came to my awareness, that people who are inclined to break and enter into someone's home, if you will put a pair of muddy work boots out on your front steps or the front of your home, it acts like the blood of a lamb on Passover. They will not break into your home because those muddy boots signal to would-be thieves that a rough and tumble, willing to get dirty and do the work person lives there. And so it's not safe for them. So you have to signal in your organization that your organization is not safe for them. And you do that by having a culture that takes complaints seriously, that avoids this elitism and this victim blaming and these different cultural elements, that takes responsibilities for itself, that puts its values up front and on display for everyone to see. Secondly, if you want to avoid this type of predation in your organization, you need to engage in what's called psychological safety. Psychological safety is an organizational culture that supports, encourages, and protects its members. Okay, it provides them an opportunity to feel emotionally and psychologically safe and physically safe as parts of the organization, that they are valued members, that this is not a place in which they will be abused and hurt. The last recommendation is that you have to not only allow for, but you must have mechanisms that allow for and a culture that expects upward descent. Upward descent is a form of member voice that communicates feedback, particularly negative feedback, against an organization's policies, values, and actions. And so you've got to be an organization that says there is nothing so sacred in this organization that somebody can't say, hey, are we sure that that's the way we want to do things? Now, I'm not talking about questioning Orthodox Christian faith, right? Like, I'm not talking about, well, your Pentecostal church needs to allow people to say, was Jesus really God? I don't know that we need to, you're not inviting dissent concerning Orthodox Christian faith. However, you are not only inviting dissent, but you have created mechanisms to facilitate dissent concerning like policy decisions and the way that you communicate about the organization and where your organization uses its money and how it goes about hiring and firing and things like that, right? Like those types of mechanisms need to be able to be examined with transparency and on occasion scrutinized. And so if you engage in these three contextual institutional contexts and cultural aspects, you will have a better chance of prohibiting predators like Daniel Savala from having initial and ongoing access to your organization. And it would...
Why? Go ahead.
I was just saying, it would be my recommendation for anybody who's listening to me that has influence, whether in their local church, their workplace, civic groups that they're a part of, that they bring these recommendations to the leaders and say, hey, we need to make sure that these recommendations are part of our culture. And it is my heartfelt recommendation that the Assemblies of God does the same.
Yeah. What would be their motivation to do it if they, and I don't know this for a fact, if they don't think there's a problem, or if the system benefits the people at the top? What I've experienced the last 2 years was the fear that is so ingrained in the culture not to speak out, not to dissent. I don't really know how you would fix that, or if there are enough adults in the room that could say, we need to fire all these guys and start over. I mean, the same team that was there who allowed this to happen, it's like a management team.
Yeah.
If this happened on your watch, it's time for you to step down and hire people that are going to put these things in process. It is so crazy to me that people that broke it now want to say, well, I'm going to fix it. Or, oh, this campus pastor now,
Yeah.
oh, we put him through a 5-hour class. He's all better.
Yeah. When Enron failed, they didn't let the people that drove Enron to failure try to fix the organization. They were fired.
Exactly.
They were thrown in jail. They were bankrupt, right? You don't let the people who got you in the situation that you're in, that is this terrible, be the ones that get you out. So this is what I know as an organizational communication scholar and expert. The number one goal of every organization is to exist.
Yeah.
And the number one goal of every organizational leader is to make decisions that enable the organization to continue to exist. In member organizations like the Assemblies of God and others, the Assemblies of God is not alone in this. We have seen the way the Southern Baptists have handled their sex scandal. We have seen the way the Catholic Church handled their sex scandal, right? I mean, we have seen these member organizations. We saw the way that Penn State handled its sex scandal, right? These organizations immediately do what it takes to protect the entity as a whole. And they will sacrifice their own members to ensure that the entity continues to exist. And most often, that the entity continues to exist unchanged, because the entity in its current makeup works for the people in charge. It worked for them, and it continues to work for them. And so when it works for the people who are responsible, they are under no motivation to change.
Yeah.
They have to assume that the barrel is fine and it's just bad apples, because if they accept that the barrel is bad, then they have to ask, are they the product of the bad barrel, or are they themselves bad barrels? Yep. And that's not, right. That is not an introspective question that they want to ask. In this situation, for the Assemblies of God, for its institutional leaders, for its ministers, to repent of this means that they must change their minds on how they perceive and accept Chi Alpha Campus Ministries to operate and move forward. They cannot make small alterations. They must see the sin that has existed and no longer tolerate it. They also must reject and change their mind concerning how the system operates that allows any of this to occur, because this is not the mere actions of a handful of people. These are bad apples who flourished in a bad barrel. And the Assemblies of God has got to replace its barrels. You got to get new barrels. Repentance requires getting new barrels.
So today we've unpacked how the system within the Assemblies of God and Chi Alpha allowed predators like Daniel Savala to infiltrate, groom, and abuse students for years. We've exposed the raw truth behind the loopholes and the cultural norms that facilitated this cycle of harm. This just isn't a tragic story of a few bad apples from the past that some would want us to believe. It's an ongoing crisis that demands action. The system is flawed, and it needs to be completely overhauled if student safety is going to be a priority. This reminds me of something Boz Tavision said. Boz is our lead attorney and the founder of Grace, which is a godly response to abuse in the Christian environment. He said, what's most alarming is how easy it's been for a registered sex offender to enter the world of Chi Alpha. The organization's leaders have given Daniel Savala literally access to untold numbers of young college students. I want to say thank you to Ryan. We so appreciate your time and all the work you've done. I know it's taking you about a year and a half to write all this up. I know after listening today, we've got more clarity into how and why the largest spiritual and sexual abuse scandal in the Assemblies of God and Chi Alpha's history was allowed to happen. I'd like to thank you guys for listening. Once Ryan's paper is officially published, I'll be turning this into a proper podcast. And remember, your story matters. You're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're not the only one going through this. God bless you guys.